Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
Hey, so I know a lot of y'all have spring already, in the works, but spring's been pretty slow to get going for us on the farm in Jack's Reef, and I can tell you this: as turkey season approaches, and I start to think about that a bit more, and we all do, turkey populations in many places are in trouble. I scouted a piece of state forest this morning that my wife and I have killed. I think we killed 4 turkeys in there over about a 5-year period a few years back. And it was complete silence. And I drove dirt roads around that area and called, on towards private land along what was perfect habitat. It was like mixed hardwood forest with some conifers, for winter roost, which is important in our part of the world. A lot of old field and abandoned hay fields for nesting, and abundant farm fields for feeding on high energy grains when necessary, and nothing. So man, something's up. I mean, I did see a bunch of wood duck, mallard, hooded mergansers, and Canada goose pairs doing their spring thing on some beaver ponds. The leaks or ramps, maybe if you call them that, are starting, and we're about a few hot seconds from morel mushroom season. One good warm wet night and morels will pop. So none of these hikes, or my hike this AM, was a loss. I mean, I don't know, I did 5,000 steps or maybe 7,500 this morning already, so healthy stuff, good to be outside. But back to turkeys. I'm not of the opinion that disturbing the mating process is the issue. Hen turkeys can store sperm for up to 45 days, right? All birds store sperm. I mean, mallards do it, and Canada geese do it. All these birds do it. They can store sperm for some time. But turkeys, after being bred just once, can store sperm for up to 45 days. I don't know, to think that hunting male turkeys in spring is so disruptive across the landscape that turkeys occupy that it's their demise from north to south, from east to west, I don't know. Seems quite absurd to me. But it's the lever many states are pulling right now, right? A lot of folks are thinking about ratcheting back their seasons and making them open later so hens have a chance to be bred. I don't know. They can store sperm for 45 days. So I think we got to think about this a little bit more. Anyhow, there's a lot of questions about turkeys out there, so stay tuned. We'll have a dedicated episode to turkeys coming sometime around midsummer. Okay, but today we introduce the FowlWeather Podcast 2024 Wetland Management Series, so I digress. We'll move away from turkeys for now. As you listen to our breakdown of wetland management, remember to send your wetland management questions to Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. That's Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. FOWL weather.co. We're going to do our best to include your questions in the rest of our 4-part wetland management series that's going to run through the month of April. Thanks for tuning in once again, my friends, and thank you for being part of the FowlWeather Podcast 2024 Wetland Management Series.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Welcome to the FowlWeather Podcast 2024 Wetland Management Series. In this series, we're going to provide context about why actively managing restored wetlands is critical. We're really excited to bring you this Wetland Management 101 cookbook for your private lands or lease, but we also highlight why the public hunting grounds that you visit should be actively managing their wetlands for waterfowl. The goal of the FowlWeather podcast wetland management series is to inform the duck hunting community about techniques used on private and public lands to improve non-breeding habitat for ducks. Said another way, our aim is to inform you about how to attract ducks to your wetland, how to feed and rest ducks during their fall migration, through winter, and into their spring migration back north to breed. Digging even deeper, the FowlWeather podcast aims to inform duck hunters how to manage wetlands to kill more ducks. We aim to help you attract, hold, see, and shoot more ducks, but also provide the food and rest resources needed to conserve ducks. We should never see duck hunting and duck conservation as mutually exclusive. They're the same thing. They are intimately linked in our past, and we hope that they are for the foreseeable future. As duck people across duck country, we aim to hunt and conserve ducks. We have coupled these activities in the U.S. through the North American model of wildlife conservation, where your dollars are earmarked and go back to conserving our wildlife resources. Because of this system, we also think it critical that duck hunters know what quality habitat for waterfowl looks like, so they can understand if public servants are providing quality duck habitat and duck hunting opportunities on national wildlife refuges and state game lands or wildlife management areas. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. My experience with wetlands management spans much of eastern North America, and I'm super excited to bring that east to west, north to south experience to our listeners. My wetland management brain is basically tuned in as a duck hunter, too. So in each management action, I think about how we can attract more ducks to shoot more ducks, but I'm also interested in how we can provide habitat to send them back north strong. I've conducted wetlands management research from southern Ontario to the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and places in between. And I will state this over and over again in this wetland management series. If you don't know your plants, none of this really matters. You have to determine what plants are reacting to your management, germinating, and producing food for ducks. If you don't know the difference between plants that produce food for ducks and those that are invasive species that compete and never produce food for ducks, you've already lost the battle. Colleagues and I produced a book several years ago called Moist Soil Wetland Plants of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, and it's a really good primer with an abundance of plant pictures in different stages of growth. But to be clear, the James C. Kennedy Endowed Chair in Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation at Mississippi State University benefits from all royalties from this book. The co-authors, including myself, do not. Those funds go into a research budget to support students, right? To support students that are the next generation of wetland scientists, conservationists, and managers through Mississippi State. The book is also important beyond the MAV because even near the home office in Jack's Reef, most of the plants in the book are covered. As we move west into the Central Flyway and specifically into kind of like the Playa Lakes region of Texas, the book, in my knowledge of plants, is a little bit less. But much of the management techniques that we'll discuss in this wetland management series still help to produce annual seed-producing plants that ducks seek out and eat. So the point of all of this, we talk in generalizations throughout this wetland management series, but we also work to point out a few specifics, such as differences in timing of drawdowns between southern and northern locales, and types of invasives that can ruin a good drawdown because they differ from north to south. Also understand that while much of the management in literature has been from the kind of mid to southern latitudes, the techniques of water drawdowns to grow annual plants and revitalize the perennial plant community work at northern latitudes right through areas as far north as southern Ontario and even farther north nowadays with a warming climate and longer growing seasons. If after this wetland management series you need additional specific information or management prescriptions, we do run wetland management workshops and conduct wetland management site visits in consultation with partners. I've run wetland management workshops in the Great Lakes region and for the Pennsylvania Game Commission, so if there is interest for you or your group, feel free to email me at drmike@fowlweather.co and we can discuss what might work. In my full-time job, I teach students how to manage wetlands in my Wetlands Conservation and Management for Wildlife course. For so many years, we increasingly had students leaving universities without the key waterfowl and wetlands knowledge to understand how to manage wetlands, and our public lands have suffered. We continue to see university students take entry-level jobs at public areas and walk up to a water control structure having no idea how to pull boards, manage water levels, manage plant communities, and produce critical duck foods to feed and attract ducks. So the Fowl Weather podcast also aims to inform hunters what quality management looks like even if you don't own property. You should know what quality management looks like to ensure our public servants are actually serving the duck hunting community that pays for conservation. My additional recommendation is to get your kids to listen to this series as well. Get them out on the lease, learning how to pull boards, control invasives, manage soil disturbance, and vegetation diversity. I also encourage university wildlife conservation and science students to share and follow the Wetland Management series because it's an excellent primer to becoming a great public servant on a national wildlife refuge or state wildlife management area. Okay, all right. Enough talk about what we're going to cover in the Fowl Weather Podcast Wetland Management series. Let's get to it. Let's start with this. Ducks are short. Think about that for a second. Mallards at best from bow to stern are about 22 inches, but from legs to tip of their bill, mallards are about 15 inches. Where can a mallard reach when fully tipped? Well, a mallard is 15 inches from webbed foot to bill tip. In comparison to a green-winged teal, a green-wing can only reach 7 inches deep. The pintail's a bit longer at 18 inches, but surprisingly, they kind of prefer these really shallow open areas very often. So if you want foods accessible to ducks, yes, they'll skim the surface of the water for food, but once those foods are saturated, those seeds sink, and tubers from plants like arrowhead and nutsedge or chufa are in the substrate. They're in the bottom of the wetland. So the water can't be any deeper than 15 inches for a mallard, and no more than a very shallow 7 inches for a green-winged teal if you want the full suite of foods that you grew in your wetland available to these ducks. How deep should your wetland be? Your wetland should serve the ducks you aim to shoot. The food you produce should be duck food. What are the best types of duck food? What are the worst invasive species that don't produce food for ducks, and how and when should they be controlled? When should you draw down a wetland to germinate plants and produce food? When should it be flooded? How do hot crops get incorporated into your wetland plan, or should they even ever be included? All of these great questions and more answered in our 4-part wetland management series. All right, the meat and potatoes here first. We typically manage wetlands for dabbling ducks such as mallards, pintails, green-winged teal, gadwall, widgeon, and shovelers. Wood ducks may use the brushy corners of your wetland, or you might have a little bit of a timber hole. If you can flood early, you also can accommodate blue-winged teal that migrate through well before other ducks on their way south, going to Central and South America for the winter. That said, the biggest mistake we see is flooding wetlands too deep. The majority of our wetlands should be flooded 18 inches or less. If you have a borrow ditch where the soil has been borrowed to create a berm to hold water, then you might have a small, deeper spot. But most of this place should be a place that these dabbling ducks can literally tip, have their feet at the surface, and be able to reach the bottom to get those sunken seeds as well as any tubers that have been produced throughout the season. If you walk out from your blind to set or move decoys and you're instantly near your belly or top of your chest waders, too deep. Now, there are lots of different wetland designs out there, but if reducing your water to ankle deep to 18 inches of deep in most of your wetland makes another good portion of your wetland go dry, it may not be engineered correctly for feeding dabbling ducks. So far, we've been talking about flooding too deep or, re-engineering your wetland or thinking about making mudflats, etc. So if you're listening and don't know what a water control structure is, just as a little primer, please go do a Google Images dump, a Google Images search of water control structures used in wetland management to get an idea. It's basically a standpipe on the wetland side, where your water is, with boards that can either be added or removed to change the water levels by flowing water through the outlet pipe that goes under the retaining berm. I'd say more often than not nowadays, wooden boards aren't used because they swell and can be difficult to move or remove from a structure. And goodness, believe me, standing in the water and chainsawing a board out of a structure is not fun. So nowadays, they're often made of metal or fiberglass, right? They don't seal as well, but typically debris gets caught, in between those boards and plugs those small gaps. So not really a big deal, but that's what a water control structure is, and how we, as we talk about drawdowns and increasing water levels or doing drawdowns, it's through adding or removing boards in this water control structure. So go ahead and, Google that and get like an image of that. We'll shoot one up on our Instagram and Facebook page here so folks understand. So when giving our wetland management workshop talk or when teaching university students, we have a slide with different types of footwear shown to describe different depths of water in wetlands and how they serve different species. Again, the intent of the FowlWeather podcast is to entertain and inform. So, the intent here, right here alone, is to make this digestible. The way we go in increasing order of water depth by footwear that we use in management workshops and with teaching university students is Crocs, muck boots or knee boots, hip waders, chest waders, and then better off with a fish finder, right? All right, let's start with those Crocs. Everyone loves a good pair of Crocs. You can walk across very shallow water without getting wet. A skim, not even an inch, or maybe an inch, right? These are mudflats, and they're loved by blue-winged teal, but other ducks will walk around and use them as well. Specifically, you'll often see green-winged teal and pintails attracted to mudflats with like these little shallow puddles here and there. You also might get snipe using these edges of wetlands that are like probing for insects. Okay. All right, I'm not talking about a snipe hunt like that joke snipe hunt. But at times, like snipe hunting can be quite exciting and provide some added benefit to your managed marsh before the majority of your ducks show up kind of later in the season, or maybe even mid-season. You can have some mudflats in your marsh for snipe shooting. But that's your croc level. Okay, so blue-winged teal like this croc level of water, right? So you can walk across a mudflat and with Crocs on and not get super wet. So blue-winged teal migrate really, really early as they leave their breeding grounds for the north, move through the mid-latitude areas into the southern U.S. before jumping into Central and South America, as well as some Caribbean islands that they hang out on. At this time, a lot of plants really haven't senesced yet or died back. They haven't finished setting seed. They're still green. So these food resources, these things we think about as duck food, just aren't available to blue-winged teal. Luckily, blue-winged teal have a bit of a flattened bill, kind of being close relatives to shovelers, and that slightly flattened bill is really good at scooping up snails and other insects on mudflats in those really shallow, kind of late summer pools. These are like croc depth-loving ducks, right? If you can make mud in August and September that you can walk across with Crocs, all right, well, maybe muck boots if you're going to sink a little bit, you're right? But you're going to have blue-winged teal habitat and like that croc footwear habitat. Later in the season, the green-winged teal and pintails will feed on any small seeds that drop from nearby annual plants onto those mudflats. Green-winged teal and pintails are small seed specialists. That is, the gaps in their lamellae, or those like tooth-like bumps on either side of their bill, well, they're really well spaced to capture small seeds that other species of dabbling ducks, like it might kind of drift right through, right? So they focus on these things like, we'll get into panic grass. So plants like panic grass produce really tiny seeds that greenwings and pintail sift through on mudflats, right? So typically, once most of the blue-winged teal have moved on, you'll start to see greenwings and pintails kind of finish up that food on that mud flat in that place where blue-wings were feeding on snails, and now the plants maybe have a nest, and greenwings and pintails can move in to take advantage of that. A specific case for producing this type of habitat might be a pool, that you typically keep filled throughout the summer to produce submerged aquatic vegetation for other species. But you might do kind of like a single board drawdown in August or September to expose the edge, or a bit more to provide kind of like that croc footwear depth habitat. You also might just get a natural drawdown from a late summer, kind of like a dry down, where it's just been dry during the summer, that produces this habitat without you doing anything, right? It might just produce that on its own, right? So be adaptive, right? Always be adaptive. You're always going to want to produce some type of seed-producing vegetation on that edge. So if you're going to keep a wetland with water in it, you might do a partial drawdown, say in June, just to expose a short edge that would green up with annual plants, annual seed-producing plants, where vegetation could grow pretty much right up to the edge of the water on that exposed mud flat. Then in late summer, you can expose another small section of mud, which is unlikely to produce any food that year because it's too late in the season, but it provides a place for like blue-winged teal to pick bugs and snails, and greenwings and pintails to find seeds from that nearby annual seed-producing plant community that germinated and grew later in the season. Another way to do this that we see, and it's probably actually more common, is to do like a full drawdown and then disc down a portion of your plant community, very small portion of it, kind of late summer, and pump or flow water onto it for blue wings to show up in that kind of like super shallow croc mudflat type territory. And I think this might be a little more common, but the problem with that is that you're basically taking a growing plant community that you have produced food on, and you are removing it by like mowing and disking it down, and then putting water on that shallow area. And it's probably going to produce some invertebrates, but you are definitely losing that plant community that you just recently grew to produce that kind of croc depth for blue-winged teal early in the season as they migrate through. Now, the next depth to consider, and probably the most important depth for nearly all dabbling ducks, and for that matter, other wetland wildlife that we typically manage for, is that muck boot or kind of knee boot depth, right? Remember, a mallard is only 15 inches tall at best. In my opinion, the knee boot range is probably the best duck attractant range and will bring kind of all species of dabbling ducks. And honestly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because, once you do your drawdowns and you grow duck food and then you hold water at kind of like that knee, human knee and below depth, you've probably produced what you need. Most of what you need to do is find a way to do that like preseason management of those areas to ensure that those ducks can get into them. So it really doesn't need a lot of explanation. It's like this prime depth, right? You do your drawdown, you grow your food, and then you rewater these areas to that depth. So I'm not going to get into it too much here. I'm going to talk more about the other depths now and get back to that probably in part 2 of the wetland management series. So the next step is hip boots, right? Which is where we really start to see at this depth some submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, like coontail, milfoil, and pondweed start to grow. These areas are really important for a couple of reasons. First, at northern latitudes, folks might not know this, but as we start to see ducks migrate into marshes from their northern breeding grounds, before a lot of our annual plants are actually at shatter stage, or that stage that you walk through a wetland on a dewy morning and the plants start to drop their seeds, and your boots are just covered with seeds, right? All that duck food, it sticks to and coats your boots. We actually have ducks move into northern latitudes before that starts to happen, right? Late August, September, even early October, before we've had a killing frost. There's a lot of green plants out there. And the other thing is that when ducks start to arrive, they just came off of summer of kind of, growing and feeding on protein. And a lot of these young ducks haven't even seen seeds yet. They don't know what they are. And some of the hens are still rebuilding protein resources. And so they're still on bugs and eating insects before they transition to carbohydrate-rich foods that are supplied from wetland seeds kind of later, right? For a bit more of timing on migration, right? If you want to know more about this timing on migration that I'm talking about and why ducks start leaving breeding areas for these first migration staging areas before they even have to because of weather, go back and listen to episode 6, A Tale of Two Migrations, and that details that information really, really well. Okay, so early in the season at northern latitudes, the plant seeds still are not available, and given that most ducks in the population just hatched a few months ago and have never seen a crop of energy-dense seeds, their brains are still cued in on bugs, right? The second reason that areas that grow SAV are important is that gadwall and widgeon have duckbills built for ripping and eating wetland vegetation. All right, sure, they eat seeds too, but they separate themselves from other ducks. They reduce competition for food by separating from other ducks and feeding in deeper areas on SAV. So they're out in these areas where they can't reach the bottom, but they can grab bills full of vegetation so they can feed deeper than, say, a mallard or a pintail or a greenwing, right? Now, shoveler, they also like this depth, but mostly for feeding on insects, and they might even jaunt out a little bit deeper than, say, the hip boot wader level. All right, now we're into chest wader level. Most of us typically use chest waders to hunt, for sure, right? But they are really just insurance for deep spots or a way to cross a narrow but deep channel. They also keep us warm around our core. But if it's necessary for you to wear chest waders to hunt in your marsh, then you've eliminated most of the feeding habitat for all ducks we just talked about, all dabbling ducks. Of course, these dabbling ducks can still feed on floating foods and seeds, kind of caught up in vegetation and on shrubs and trees. But that just ain't a lot of the surface area of your wetland, and you've already greatly reduced food for your ducks. There's also the case in flooded timber of kind of like big open roost holes where ducks will use, but they're typically, using these areas during mild conditions when they don't have to feed a lot, or they've already fed and they're just looking for kind of safety and thermal refuge at these kind of deep holes that are kind of near food or other good flooded moist soil, areas or crop fields. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't wear chest waders to duck hunt, just that if you must wear chest waders to get, across the majority of our wetland, then it's probably too deep if your aim is to shoot dabbling ducks that are feeding in that area. In these chest wader areas, you'll continue to find submerged aquatic vegetation, but also the depth that things like ringnecks, buffleheads, redheads, coots, not a duck, hooded mergansers, barely a duck, and occasionally other diving ducks like scaup or bluebills like to, kind of feed. You're also going to see gadwall and widgeon continue in these areas to feed if they're if they're not just wide open area pools, but if they've got like a good mix of maybe some other emergent vegetation, cattails and bulrushes, along with some deep areas where there's submerged aquatic vegetation. Shovelers also use these areas and because they're frequent feeders in deep areas with invertebrates, right? But you're going to lose your feeding areas, your major feeding areas for your bread and butter ducks like mallards, greenwings, pintails, and wood ducks when you're in a wetland where you have to wear chest waders to get across the whole entire thing. Lastly, I'm going to cover the better off with a fish finder depth. Consistently, this is the depth that many public hunters actually ask for so they can run a boat or paddle a canoe with ease. Over my years, my sense is that this request comes from a twofold reason. First, the area that these folks once hunted was managed by someone that did not know what they were doing for years and held water too high. Right, they have great memories of that place. Sure, they shot some ducks, but those guys, they like to paddle the canoe in, and they only remember the good old days, not the days they just ate sandwiches and drank coffee, but never shot a duck. Second, this cohort that's been there for years in an area where the water's been managed so high that you could always paddle a canoe in or drive a boat, this cohort's getting older and doesn't really want to slog through thick plants. They don't want to slog through massive mounds of duck food producing plants because that's kind of a youngster's game, right? Anyhow, the point is that this stuff you need to boat for, and at our latitude here in Jack's Reef, you'll find cormorants, common mergansers, and gulls on this type of habitat, right? None of these are really ducks that we typically pursue and shoot. It's also the type of stuff that I think we should keep our eye out for as duck hunters. If this is the majority of your public waterfowl hunting area, better off with a fish finder. Well, I guess first direct them here to this podcast series. They might learn something, but also it might be good to provide appropriate and polite public comment. You can find ducks for shooting for sure in these areas, but unless they can dive, you aren't really producing much food in these areas for them that they can reach, right? The big open deep pools on national wildlife refuges and WMAs stem from people not being able to think beyond, the box of it needs to be wet. They don't have adequate training on the use of water control structures, and they're probably just putting all the boards in and walking away for years on end. So, but I do want to put a caveat on here, and we'll cover the emergent marsh cycle in part 2 of our wetland management series. But on some of these wetlands, on national wildlife refuges and WMA complexes, when they're at full pool, full flooded deep capacity, they might just be in a stage of the emergent marsh cycle. But if all pools are consistently at full pool on those areas, then there's probably a manager at the helm that doesn't know how to produce a diverse plant community to benefit the diversity of wildlife that includes, ducks on these public lands, and you're probably not serving that duck hunting community properly by growing appropriate foods. All of that said, and maybe you only have one wetland that you lease, we'll get to that. But first, if you have a complex of wetlands or the ability to manage wetlands with varying depths, I'd shoot for about the following combination of depths. I'd say, put 75% of your area in croc to knee boot, stage, and then gradually into the hip boot and chest wader stage with about an even amount of both that kind of hip and chest wader stage kind of later in the season. If there's a scrubby kind of willow or buttonbush hole kind of holding water a bit deeper in some areas, that can't hurt, especially for times when it gets cold, to stave off some freezes and hold birds around, right? So the idea here is that if you have multiple units, say like 5 different wetlands, I'd go with like 3 in that shallow stage, that kind of croc to knee boot, 1 in that kind of hip boot to chest wader, with a good mix of SAV, but also some emergent perennial plants. And then lastly, I'd look to have like 1 really deep hole, mostly for roosting and just the water footprint for visual attraction. But, remember too that SAV takes a few years to establish that submerged aquatic vegetation. I had students a few years ago. This is a fun one. I had students a few years ago, couldn't remember submerged aquatic vegetation, so they just started calling it wet lettuce. So maybe we'll just call it wet lettuce on the podcast from now on. But it takes a few years for wet lettuce to establish. So you can't dry out a wetland and expect abundant SAV the first year after flooding, right? The areas of your wetland or specific units where you want SAV have to have water year-round. So think about these areas when designating kind of building out your wetland complex or your lease, or if you're purchasing something like and you're trying to design it, build in pools that remain wet year-round. But if you're aiming to shoot dabbling ducks over duck-rich kind of food areas, annual plant seed producing areas are really the majority of what you should be looking for. If you only have a single wetland or a lease, say 10 to 12 acres, I'd shoot for like 2/3 of that really shallow and that 1/3 deeper, but no deeper than chest waiter, of course. If you have a borrow ditch, that's going to be like deep, deep, deep. But I'd shoot for most of this stuff pretty shallow and then just a little bit of like more deep area for sure. You also have to think about your season. And if mallards aren't showing up, late, then mostly what you have around is green-winged teal, then you're going to want to hold everything low. I mean, like really low. Like you should be able to walk across it and have it only about just above your boot toe. Right, early in the season, portions of your wetland should still basically remain dry, and that's okay because later on when you flood them, that's new food, for the mallards and for the other ducks. Right, you don't have to flood everything to its gills before the season starts. All right, so the depth game's super important, and each of you is going to need to adapt to kind of your unique position of what ducks are around and what's working. But as a general rule, never fully flood your entire wetland or all your units fully before the season starts, right? I'd sustain a portion of your area in permanent water for roost and kind of wet lettuce growth, but not much of it. And then in your areas that you drew down, gradually bring that water up in your units that were not permanently water all year. Think about the duck community going from blue-winged teal to wood ducks, and then those early migrants like green-winged teal, gadwall, widgeon, shovelers, and some pintails, and then eventually to mallards and, black ducks if you got them and you're in that range. So gradually move water up, right? Many places I've seen on private land in the South, mostly the MAV, are actually still too deep in December. If the mallards haven't shown up, don't make your wetland too deep, right? It's pretty simple. If you got short ducks, feed short ducks. If you got tall ducks, find ways to feed tall ducks. But these should be probably done in stages. All right, so we kind of covered the depth thing and the different ducks that might use those. But in this series, we're also going to talk about management on two basic types of systems. And there's more than this, but these are the two we're going to cover in this 4-part series this year. Moist soil units and the emergent marsh cycle, those two. Active management in both these systems is necessary, and in part 2 of the FowlWeather podcast wetland management series, we will detail further why active management of wetlands on private lands, national wildlife refuges, and wildlife management areas is necessary. It's not really optional, but necessary. So let's define moist soil wetland management and the emergent marsh cycle. The key here is that moist soil management is nearly always a component of the multi-year emergent marsh cycle, but the dedicated moist soil wetland units are basically that, dedicated moist soil wetland units, and are not considered part of the emergent marsh cycle. Because of differences in hydrological dynamics or natural flooding and drying cycles, the emergent marsh cycle is more commonly applied from the prairies, across the Great Lakes region, and into the Northeast U.S. and Mid-Atlantic region. Dedicated moist soil management becomes increasingly common around the Mississippi River drainage from Illinois south through Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The emergent marsh cycle is what it sounds like. It is a cycle, a multi-year cycle whereby emergent plants colonize, but over time the wetland becomes stale, the nutrients are locked up in the substrate, the marsh begins to degrade and become stagnant, plant diversity declines, duck foods decline, and then we do a drawdown for a 1 to 3 year period and we get moist soil conditions. Then the emergent perennial plant community comes back slowly and the entire cycle starts again. More in part 2 on the emergent marsh cycle and how to manage the water levels and plants using this method. Today, we're mostly going to focus on the basics of moist soil management units. Please understand that most of the time we can't just detail all of the unique situations of soil, hydrology, and location to make everything here a blanket statement. For a detailed assessment of individual properties, please contact me at drmike@fowlweather.co, FOWL weather.co, and we can look to hook you up with someone to complete a thorough management plan. Okay, so let's start with dedicated moist soil units because they are relatively easy compared to the adjustments that are needed in the emergent marsh cycle. All right. First, let's not church it up, period. Don't overthink moist soil management. In simplest terms, you are creating the disturbance that river flooding and scouring once did for us. But because we don't let river systems flood and dry like they once did, because nutrient-rich floodwaters are largely confined within levees, we must mimic that natural occurrence of flooding and drying that would leave large patches of unvegetated, exposed soils where annual plants would germinate. The best approach to all wetland management is to think like a river. Think about how the system worked before alteration. Think it this way. All the plants and animals are adapted to a pattern of flooding and drying in these dynamic, very change-driven wetland systems, dynamic systems. Lots of change. So first and foremost, wetlands are dynamic. They change. They get really, really wet and they get really, really dry. Sometimes on a yearly cycle, but then there may be these longer periods of stability. So in the dynamic periods, these periods of rapid flooding and drying, annual plants that produce a lot of energy-rich seeds are common. Why? Well, annual plants must produce a lot of seed, and it must be energy-rich because they're not coming back from the roots. The parent plant dies each year, so it invests energy into ensuring its genetics are in that seed. There's a lot of that seed with their genetics, and that seed has a lot of stored energy because it isn't sure when the next time there will be an opportunity for it to germinate. It may have to sit in the soil for decades before conditions are good enough again for germination. Of course, with dedicated moist soil units, we mimic those disturbance conditions on an annual basis. And those seeds, therefore, reproduce like crazy, put a ton of duck food out, and are easy to reproduce year after year on that plot of land. For perennial plants, they creep in over time with stable conditions and are producing less seed than an annual plant, and it tends to be less energy dense. Why? A perennial plant comes back from its roots or tubers every single year. The top dies, and it comes back from its roots. So it spends a little bit of energy on seed to make an effort to see if its kids can get out there elsewhere to germinate someplace else someday. But those perennial plants aren't as worried about seed because they got roots and they're probably coming back at the same place under those stable conditions. So a drawdown is necessary to revitalize the perennial plant community, but in dedicated moist soil units, most of the plants you're aiming for are annual seed-producing plants. You're making density, really dense duck food moist soil units. For example, in seed density, a good moist soil wetland can push 2,000 kilograms per hectare or more, right? Annual plant communities can produce 2,000 kilograms per hectare or more in a good moist soil unit. whereas a perennial plant community is generally more around 500 kilograms or less. So you're getting a lot less bang for your buck. So why keep some perennials around a bit? Why keep some wet spots on your property? They provide insurance, but they also provide diverse nutrition to a diversity of seeding-eating birds, and produce plants like soft-stem bulrush and burr reeds that create patches of cover and seclusion for ducks. It's kind of something they really like once they're paired. But again, let's not church it up. You're basically doing everything you want to prepare a farm field, but just don't plant the corn. Don't plant the soybeans. You basically want to expose soil and beat it up a bit with a light disking. The timing of a drawdown can create differences in plant communities too, so the aim is to do a slow drawdown in your wetland in the spring or summer by removing a single 6-inch board or two from your water control structure at a time. Expose soil, and if needed, you can get equipment on it once it dries. Disc it lightly, but no more than 6 inches deep. If you can run a cultipacker or something behind it that gets kind of a more smooth surface, this really seems to be better for getting good seed to soil contact and kind of a better germination rate and a lot better plant community.
In a way, it ends where it begins.
Very insightful.
Thank you for sharing this Red Baron with us, Linda. It's so tasty, it makes me want to share something of my own. I didn't actually read the book.
Me neither.
I watched the movie last night.
I judged it by its cover.
I haven't read a book since middle school.
I'm secretly seeing 2 other book clubs.
But I can't even read.
I'm not really Gary. He just paid me to be here. Sharing Red Baron pizza can lead to more sharing.
Remember, all of these annual and perennial plant seeds are already in the soil. We get this question all the time. What seeds do I need to buy? You don't. They're there. These are weed seeds. Think about this. Your garden will grow weeds. Just till it. Once that section that you've dewatered and maybe provided a little disturbance to greens up, pull another board, and so on and so forth until the entire moist soil unit is dry and greened up. Never, ever, never, ever, never, never, never pull the bottom board from your water control structure. You will get sediment in that bottom slot, and you'll never get a good seal again. Your entire water control structure will leak water forever. So if you completely dewater your moist soil unit, always leave in the bottom board, right? My preference actually is to retain water in the borrow ditch if you've got one throughout the growing season so that your wetland unit is kind of easier to rewater in the fall and winter. It doesn't just act like a sponge for weeks at a time while you try to put water back on it. So why the slow drawdown? Certainly you can dry up a unit and then put equipment on it all at once. But the problem with that is it's likely that conditions across that unit will be all the same all at once across every inch of soil. The moisture and temperature will all be the same. And the seeds that germinate are more likely to be from a single plant. That might be something like barnyard grass, like a wild natural millet that ducks love. Or it might be cocklebur, which is not edible by ducks and will shade out all other plants. At this point, you'll need to do an herbicide down that entire stand of cocklebur and hope for rain and heat that sets off some quality, annual producing grass that produce seeds for ducks. With a slow drawdown, you produce soil moisture and temperature conditions that vary across the growing season, and under different conditions, different species of plants will germinate. So you might get some cocklebur, but you might get some red vine, you might get some coffee weed, and you can spot treat those areas and knock it back. But you typically won't get an entire wetland full of invasive plants not useful for ducks. So I just named 3 invasive plants that our southern folks have all heard of, but our northern folks, the invasives are different and actually not nearly as bad in moist soil wetlands. Again, that moist soil wetland plant book we produce will be helpful in Plant ID, which is kind of critical throughout this process. At northern latitudes, the problem plants, those problem critters that tend to creep into your wetlands are Phragmites, cattail, reed canary grass, and kind of woody vegetation like cottonwoods. But here's the deal. Within the growing season, if you have a dedicated moist soil unit in like the Great Lakes region and you dry it up and you beat the heck out of the soil at the right time in spring or early summer, most of the time those invasives will have really heavy competition from annual seed producing grasses and just can't, keep up. They get out competed, and you can just spot herbicide to keep them at bay most of the time. So even if you have some of these problem plants, if the plan is to turn it into a moonscape and watch annual weeds grow again and produce that duck food for next year, it doesn't really matter. But you do need to monitor to keep that in check, right? By far the worst thing you can do for a moist soil wetland at a northern latitude is fall tillage without having already completed a spring tillage. Why is that? If you just do the drawdown with no major soil disturbance, over time perennials are going to creep in, right? Even like plants like goldenrod can become super abundant. And if you only fall till to set back succession, all you're going to do is chop up cottonwood, phragmites, goldenrod, you name it. You're chopping up those roots and making multiple plants that then have time to establish in the spring because you don't do an appropriate spring or early summer tilling to set off the annual seed producing community that, under that disturbance regime would outcompete the perennials, right? So a moist soil unit that has fall tillage only regime will fail. It is by far the worst one thing that you can do at northern latitudes, right? We don't have a lot of competitors if you do spring tillage at the right time, as compared to those folks in the south that run into things like red vine and coffee weed and cocklebur. I mean, the invasives in the south are pretty rough, and it does take a little bit of herbicide and watching the timing and doing some mid-season treatment to take care of those things. Okay, so now you have all this great vegetation growing in your moist soil unit. So what's next? In the future episodes, we're going to cover within growing season management and pre-hunting season management. For now, we'll leave you with kind of this dream of a lush green field, right? Annual seed-producing plants sitting in that hot summer sun making duck foods. We also haven't covered the timing of drawdowns for maximum duck food production on moist soil wetlands. And we'll get into all of that. It's sometimes more art than science, but we'll cover drawdown timing in part 2 of our 2024 wetland management series. A word of caution here. Please ensure you follow federal and state regulations regarding wetlands, water rights, hydrological management, and herbicide application. Right? These vary by region, and you should probably consult with an expert trained in wetlands management if you're not aware of what those are or what's allowed in your area. You should check with somebody. The FowlWeather podcast is not liable for your poor judgment. So, yeah, got that. Remember to let your hunting buddies, your kids, those aspiring university students out there looking to become waterfowl and wetland scientists, conservation, and managers to tune into the FowlWeather podcast wetland management series. We're going to run this for 4 weeks in April as a 4-part series. We're going to cover the emergent marsh cycle next episode, as well as important information about why wetland management is necessary or even critical for conserving ducks and duck hunting. We're going to continue to cover kind of the mid-growing season and pre-hunting season actions to maximize the chances of producing duck foods and putting ducks in front of your blind. We're also going to cover disturbance management on hunt clubs and public hunting areas, as well as how hot foods or crops can be incorporated into your hunt management scheme, and when to not think about inclusion of domestic crops in waterfowl management. All of this and more on the FowlWeather Podcast Wetland Management Series. Also, please send any wetland management questions to us that you and your friends are interested in or debate in the blind. Send those questions to Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. Remember, we are the forecast to your next successful hunt, and in this series, we will show you how to set the table for when those ducks arrive. The Wetland Management Series aims to help you attract, hold, see, and shoot more ducks. Well, we can't cover the shooting straight. That's up to you. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled. And shoot straight, my friends.